have a better understanding, and you can hopefully go away and do your own carbon footprint if you so wish on your own farm. So yes, the topic of carbon accounting, as Charlotte said, I work for the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And the Farm Carbon Toolkit is a farmer-led organisation. We were set up back in 2009, which was sort of last time carbon and climate and everything like that was really focused on. And it was set up because it was felt there was lots of information out there about why farmers should do something around reducing greenhouse gas emissions or improving energy resilience or business resilience. But there wasn't really anything out there that sort of showed farmers how to do something about it, and looked at some of those practical options that are available in terms of both reducing emissions and building soil health. So that's where the Farm Carbon Toolkit came from. And as I say, we're farmer-led. So we have 6 directors who are all full-time farmers, and then there's a project manager and myself who look after the sort of day-to-day delivery of the projects and the other bits and pieces that we're doing. But it's very much all designed to have that practical element to it, and also look at how things that you might do on farm in terms of reducing emissions have a benefit back to your business at the end of it. As Charlotte said, as we go through, if you have any questions or any of those sort of things, please do please do pop them in the chat, or when we get to the point, do shout out, because it's really worth making sure that you all leave with a good understanding of what's happening. So I'm just sorry, apologies. I think I've got the wrong presentation up. So if you just apologies for 2 minutes. I think no, I don't. I have the right one up. Apologies. I've just been preparing 2 today, so that's my fault. So I will. Sorry, that was shoddy, wasn't it? Let's try that again. Right, there we go. So we shall go back to there. Sorry, I thought I was doing a different one. And as Charlotte said, yeah, I've been involved with Farm Carbon Toolkit for the last 8 years. And I did a Nuffield scholarship. So back in 2016 actually, I spent 2 years flying around the world, increasing my own carbon footprint, learning about how we communicate carbon reduction schemes to farmers. So I've got to make sure that now, since I've expanded all that carbon doing that, I've got to make sure that I come back and share some of those good practice things around everybody else as well. So if we have a quick overview in terms of where we are, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, hopefully none of this is new to anybody. But unlike other industries who are focusing on carbon dioxide emissions that usually come from the burning of fossil fuels, we're slightly more complicated within agriculture, in the fact that we're not just dealing with one gas, we're dealing with 3 gases. And we're not just dealing with those 3 gases, we're dealing with the interplay between those 3 and looking at how they interact with each other. And so, although a lot of the language and a lot of the communication around this area is very much focused on carbon, we're talking about net zero carbon, we're talking about carbon footprinting and all those other sort of things. For agriculture, as you can see from that pie chart, carbon is only a very small percentage of our issue. Carbon dioxide emissions are about 10% of agriculture's emissions. The vast majority of our emissions come from 2 other gases, nitrous oxide and methane. And together, the combination of those 3 gases from our industry make up about 10% of UK's emissions. So agriculture is responsible for just under 10% of UK's emissions. You could say that for that 10% we get 90% of the flack, but it is only 10% of emissions. But here, although it's complicated, here we have one of the really beneficial things in terms of there's lots of opportunities to actually manage carbon and manage our greenhouse gas emissions on the farm and also improve our business efficiency. So there's a really, really good link between emissions and efficient use of resources. So that means that for each of us as a farmer, we're able to find those things that we can do, just tweaking our business slightly, which means that we're going to improve the return back to the business and also improve our carbon footprint. However, having said that, there isn't one magic management practice or a silver bullet that will sort all these issues out. Each of your farms is a unique combination of what happens under the ground, what falls out of the sky, and what you do in the middle. And so because of that, we all have a diversity of farming systems, of farming types, of landscapes, and of habitats. So we need to make sure that the system that we create and the management practices that we decide that we're going to do are right for our farm. So we all have to work together. We have to engage with researchers, with industry, with policymakers, with farmers, everybody working together to look at what are the practices that might work best on your individual farm. It's also really important to remember at this point that we're not just producing these emissions for the sake of producing these emissions. We're producing these emissions because we're producing food. And that's the thing that's quite often forgotten about. If you take the average carbon footprint of a human being in the UK, their carbon footprint for a year is about 9.7 tonnes. And obviously a lot of that is made up of consumption. So that's what a person has. If you think about emissions that come from a farm, we're producing those emissions because we're actually producing food that those people can eat. And so we really need to look at that linkage there. It's difficult to measure because, as I say, we're not just dealing with one gas, we're dealing with three. And also, it's a sort of leaky system. So agriculture is a leaky system. So if we were to take all farming operations off the ground and actually just let the landscape be as it were, potentially, in its sort of more natural habitat, it would still produce emissions irrespective of what we do on top of it, because it's a leaky system, because the interplay between the carbon and the nitrogen cycle would produce emissions. It's also dependent on the weather. So actually, if we have a winter like we had last year, where it does nothing but rain and our soils are wet and compacted and all those sort of things, our soils are going to be producing nitrous oxide emissions irrespective of what we do to them, because when we hit certain meteorological conditions, actually that one of the byproducts of that is greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got to look at what we can do and what the opportunities we have are to mitigate those emissions, but also potentially look at things like adapting our systems in the future. Come along, move. There we go. So why is there such a focus on agriculture at the moment? And you'll see this graph here, which has been produced by the Department of Business, Energy and Strategy, or BEIS as they like to be called. And you can see all the different coloured lines there represent the different sectors of our economy. And you can see, hopefully, there that green line, this wiggly green line here, and that's agriculture. And you can see that since 1990, because when we look at the policies that are associated with greenhouse gas emissions, 1990 is our target, is our sort of baseline level. So when we look at the sort of Climate Change Act and now the net zero, it's against those 1990 levels that we're looking at. And you can see that agriculture, although we had a bit of a good point here where we managed to reduce our emissions quite a lot, since about 2002, we've basically continued quite samey. We haven't done very much, whereas some of the other industries have decarbonised a lot quicker than we have. And so this is one of the reasons why there's such an attention on agriculture, in the fact that not only are we not really doing a huge amount in terms of our progress, but also as other industries decarbonise, the amount of that pie chart which is taken up by agriculture gets bigger. So yeah, one of the reasons why policy is looking at us at the moment. And if we just look at why we should manage carbon on the farm from that bigger picture point of view, well, as I said, we've got national, and as Charlotte said, we've got national targets to reduce carbon emissions from agriculture. We started off with those targets that were the Climate Change Act, which we were very proud of here in the UK, because we were the first country to put legislation in place in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% from that 1990 level by 2050. That's obviously now been superseded by net zero, which the UK government passed into law last June, and that says that we need to be at net zero by 2050. We then have the NFU saying that 2050 is too far away. We're going to be net zero as an industry by 2040. And we actually have some local authorities and county councils who are saying, declaring their climate emergencies and setting their net zero targets for 2030. And there's some sort of different supply chains and other sort of industry who are setting even more stringent targets and saying they're going to be carbon neutral by, or net zero by 2025 or 28, all those things. There's a bit of a race at the bottom to see who's going to get there first, and who's going to be able to sort of take the marketing advantage from having that. We also have international targets. So if we sort of look more widely than what's happening within the UK, then obviously part of that is that we're signed up to the Paris Climate Accord, and that's all of us together globally looking to really try and pull our actions together to limit global temperature rise to allow us to continue to maintain life as we know it at the moment. And all of this means that there is an increasing attention on agriculture, because under the Climate Change Act back in 2008, agriculture was seen as a difficult sector, and as such we were under voluntary emissions reductions targets. So we had a voluntary target of a reduction in 3 million tonnes by 2050. And as you'll see from that line that I showed you on the graph previously, we've not really achieved very much in terms of emissions reductions across us as an industry. So that's why there's one of the reasons why there's an increasing attention, and the fact that now we've got these more stringent targets, agriculture also has to step up and play its part. But if we zoom back down a minute and look at why should we manage carbon at a farm level, well, it makes business sense. There's a really good relationship between efficient use of resources, reduction in costs, and reduction in carbon footprint. It allows us to be more informed and make decisions, and that's where, when I show you in a minute how the carbon calculator works, you can then start to see, well, how can I use this information to model what I might want to do in the future and understand the impact of those decisions on my carbon footprint. It enables a positive narrative, and we really need a positive narrative in this discussion. At the moment, quite often, the narrative around agriculture's emissions and agriculture's carbon footprint is being sort of told for us by people that might have an alternative agenda. And there's a really good opportunity for us to be able to start to tell our stories and look at what we're doing in terms of our carbon credentials, and use that to have a really different discussion with the consumer. It creates more resilient businesses, and it allows us to be future-proofed. As Charlotte said, you know, there's a lot of attention and lots of work and activity going on in terms of policy. So being able to look at your carbon footprint currently and start to think about some of the things that you might be able to do in the future to reduce emissions and improve sequestration really puts you on the front foot in terms of being able to be adaptable and ready for whatever comes post CAP. And all of that process starts by carbon footprinting, and that old adage of you can't manage what you don't measure. So measuring your carbon footprint and being able to identify it is that first step in being able to quantify the contribution that that farm or your farm is making to climate change. So how do we do a carbon footprint, you may ask? Well, quite simply, all a carbon footprint is identifies the amount and the source of those 3 different gases. So carbon dioxide, so that's emitted on farm from the burning of fossil fuels through electricity, through diesel usage, through cultivation of our soils in terms of tillage, methane, which is obviously from our ruminant livestock and how we manage our manures and our slurries, and then nitrous oxide, which is coming from our soils, our fertilizers and our manures. So areas on the farm which are emitting those 3 gases, and then highlights areas where you might make improvements or changes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It highlights current sequestration. So where currently on the farm you are holding carbon out of the atmosphere, you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and holding it on the farm. And offsetting, so are you producing any renewable energy? Have you got any areas of forestry? Are you recycling your waste? All those sort of things provide you an offsetting option, and evaluate future projects. Because although agriculture is very, very complicated in terms of the fact that we've got 3 gases and we're intrinsically linked to food production, all the rest of it, we're also incredibly lucky because we're the only industry that provides that climate solution in terms of our ability to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold it on our farm. So we need to be able to account for that within the metrics and the footprinting that we use. It allows you to become more aware and make more informed decisions, but those metrics that you use need to be relevant. So they need to make sense to your business. They need to be practical, so they need to ask you the questions that you need to answer in terms of getting a true reflection of what's going on within your business. They need to be consistent, and consistency is something that we've had a few issues with in carbon footprinting in the past, in the fact that we haven't really got that consistent or that almost level playing field in terms of all of the tools that are out there are using the same the same assumptions. They're using 95% of the assumptions that are being used are the same, certainly across the 3 main calculators. And again, use whichever calculator works best for your system, but make sure that you continue to use the same calculator. So I don't mind if you choose to use, Cool Farm Tool or AgriCalc or whatever, use whatever's best for you. But make sure that once you have chosen a calculator to use, you stick with it, because then when you redo it next year or the year after and you see a change, that change will be as a genuine result of your change in management or anything you've done, rather than the fact that you've changed the tool that you're using. However, having said that, at the same time, we're also doing some work in terms of trying to lobby government to really start to get more consistency and update the current standards around carbon footprinting, which haven't been updated since 2011. And inform behavioural change. So the process of carbon footprinting shouldn't be so hideous that you have to then go and lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks to get over it. That carbon footprinting process is that first step in being able to say, so what does this tell me and what can I do differently? One of the other things that we have when we look at carbon is the fact that although carbon footprints are really useful for both environmental and economic reasons, they can be quite difficult to visualize. If I asked you guys to think about how much space a ton of carbon dioxide would take up, it's really, really tricky. And if I start, if we look, we've got sort of 8 things there on that slide. And if I said, well, which of those produced the most emissions and which were the sort of, baddies in terms of high levels of emissions, and which were the ones that were potentially producing less emissions. Sometimes it's quite tricky to sort of order those in terms of from the most emissions to the least, and sometimes the results can slightly surprise you. But actually, what carbon footprints allows us to do is it allows us to try and contextualize carbon and put it into a language and a format that's easier to understand. So how do we do it in terms of calculating our carbon footprint? Well, there's various different stages, which I'll show you on the calculator. We'll set up an account and we'll do it on there. But basically, there's a few different stages. We have to register on whichever footprint calculator you want to use. Register, collect your data, enter the data into the calculator, get the results, and then say, so what? And what's happened previously is that a lot of attention has been focused on the actual data collection and the data entry stage of it, okay? And I will hold my hands up at this point and say that the data collection is the most boring part of this process, okay? So even Sado like me that does this all day, every day, the data collection is not fun, okay? It will not be a fun process to dig out all the bits that you need to fill in the calculator. And we're sort of almost unashamedly need a lot of information, because what we're trying to provide is a real accurate and true reflection of what's going on the farm, so that you can start to understand the impact of your management practices and the impact of the things that are happening on the farm. And so in order to get that level of information, there is quite a lot of information that needs to go in first, and we'll have a look at those different sections in a minute. But the whole idea is that, you know, that's just a process that you need to go through. And then as you enter it into the calculator, the bit where we really should focus on is what's it telling me, what's my number, and then what can I do about it? So interpreting the results is really, really the key, should be the key focus, rather than getting really bogged down with how we put the information in. And hopefully after this afternoon, we'll all have a better understanding of how to do that. So interpreting results is a key part of that process. It can be used to evaluate where you are now in terms of your current position, and plan where you might want to go in the future in terms of reducing emissions and improving sequestration. Gives you a baseline. It really puts that line in the sand in terms of this is where we are now, and we can start to now look at what we might want to do in the future. Allows you to become more informed. Provides evidence to change your management. So what would the impact be on my carbon footprint if I did this or that or anything like that? So let's have a go. So I will show you now how to go into the calculation, and we'll have a look at that. Does anyone have any questions? I'll just pause at that point if anything in the chat, Charlotte, or any of that sort of thing. Any questions on that, or are we happy to go? You're on mute.
Nothing from me or in the chat as yet, but
okay,
if anyone does think one.
That's fine. We shall, there we go. Okay, so hopefully you can all now see the Farm Carbon Calculator screen. So if you log on, or if you go to the website, you will normally end up, if you type in Farm Carbon Toolkit.org.uk, you will end up at this screen here. This is the main home of the website. If you then click on Carbon Calculator, you will then go to the Carbon Calculator page, which is this page here. And I'll just show you on the home page, there's lots of helpful resources which will hopefully make this process a little bit easier. You'll see down here there's a how-to video. So there's a video that my colleague Jonathan has done, and there's a sort of 5-minute video about how to work through the different sections. So if you want a quick reminder at any point in the future, you can look at that. There's a whole range of FAQs down here about, frequently asked questions about how long it takes to fill in, all those sort of things, which are quite useful. The really interesting bits here are around what's included. So if you want to have a better understanding of what's in the calculator, where those figures have come from, and how the sort of assumptions have been made, I draw your attention to the references over here, which everything that's put within the calculator is peer reviewed and is based on the latest science. And all of the links to everything that forms the back of the calculator sits within that references page. Also here, we know that none of the calculators are perfect. It's an evolving science. So the things that we're going to improve in the next section, the next update of the calculator gets updated every January, is all in there, so you can get a bit more of an understanding that's going on there. And again, in terms of what's included and what's not. So again, our compliance with current carbon footprinting standards, and all that information is all in there. So all of that information is there. References there if you want to look at those. And then we've got these things up the top here that we can start to add in. So resources is really useful in terms of the data collection. So you might want to collect all the information in a notebook or whatever, and then just plug it in straight into the calculator. But if you don't, and you want to collect it all in a spreadsheet, if my internet behaves itself and actually does what it needs to do, then you'll see that there's a spreadsheet, there's a downloadable spreadsheet option, so that you can collect all the information in a spreadsheet format before you then enter it into the calculator. Unfortunately, if you put it into the spreadsheet, the calculator doesn't then magically suck it out of the spreadsheet and enter it into the calculator. You do still have to enter it yourself, but it's a way of holding all that information in one place. Right, let's go away if you're not going to behave. Right. Wonder whether we'll right, I will show you that one in a minute when it starts to behave itself. And then you'll see these two buttons up here, which are very much, if you are registering for the first time, then you click the register button, and you end up with you just put in your email address and your username, and you create a password, agree to the terms and conditions as always, and then create a new account. Okay, there's the resource. Right, let's see, are you going to go in that way, or are you still being silly? Let's see.
If it won't work, Becky, I have got it here.
Oh, yeah, didn't know why that page is being slow. We'll leave it there for a minute and see if it comes back in a sec. So I'm obviously going to log in because I've got an account, and you'll see here that it's going to go to a whole list of my reports. So when you log in for the first time, you will come to this page, but instead of there being a whole list of different reports down here, you will just have a blank bit there. And the bit that you then need to do is you need to click on Add New Report, and that will start you a new carbon report. So what do we need to do? Let's just see. Yeah, I don't know why the resources pages isn't working for me. But anyway, never mind, we should continue. So we're going to create a new report, which we just do by clicking this Add New Report section. Oh, are you going to let me go? Let's see if we'll go this way. Now, I will show you what it looks like now because I have it open as a spreadsheet. So, there we go. So, this is what the data collection spreadsheet looks like. Okay, and the first thing I would say when I show you this data collection spreadsheet is please don't look at it and exhale loudly and say, oh my goodness, that's a lot of information. So I have to, whenever I send this to farmers, I have to caveat it with 2 points. Firstly, this spreadsheet has been designed to cover all farming systems and all farming types. So you are never going to put an entry in every single box that's available on this spreadsheet. Okay, it's a massive spreadsheet. You're not ever going to need to put all of those in, but we have to cater for all eventualities. So it is a massive spreadsheet. There is long lists of things within it, but please don't worry about it. You're not going to have to fill all of them in. The second thing is that when we carbon footprint, we tend to work it on a 12-month period. It doesn't matter which 12-month period you use. You can create an account for your cropping year, for a calendar year, for a financial year, whichever one makes more sense to you in terms of your being able to collect the data. The only thing I would say is just make sure you're consistent. So if you do it 1 year using your financial year, make sure that when you do it again, you're using the same set of assumptions. So you can see here that as we go down, there's a range of different tabs along the bottom here. And these tabs along here refer to the categories that we'll find within the calculator. So you'll see here that in the fuel section, there's a range of different fuel types that you just put your information in. And there's also quite a lot of useful, helpful hints in terms of where you might find this information. And you can see along here, there's a range of different tabs with information here. And you can start to put that in there, and then you can transfer it over into the calculator. Right, so that's the data collection spreadsheet, which I'm glad we've managed to make work, which is good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our report. Okay, so this is the sort of basic information that we use for the report. So we would put our farm name in here. Let's put that in there. It automatically populates the data of the report, and then we've got a range of different categories here that we might want to tick, which if they correspond to our business. So and all this information does is this information is helping us in the next version, which is coming out in January, to create some benchmarking reports, because it's one of the feedback that we got from our farmers was saying, well, it's great, the calculator is great, but we get to the results and we sort of have a number and we say, well, so what? What does that mean? So one of the things we've been trying to do is create some benchmark. Obviously, the best person to benchmark with is yourself year on year. So depending on which sort of farming type you select down here, you will see some anonymized data that is from other farms that correspond to the type of farm that you've selected here. You can select more than one, select as many as you like. And that's just, you know, that's allowing us to do that benchmarking bit at the back. Soil type, again, if you've got multiple soil types, please don't worry. This is again allowing us to do some benchmarking by soil type. So it's not pre-populating anything else. It's just a thing for us to be able to pick up some benchmarking. And then your area here. So you can the area under your land use on the farm is broken down into 3 different categories. It's broken down into cultivated, which is areas where you would be growing your annual crops or your temporary grass lays. Grass, which is your permanent pasture, and then non-cropping, which might be your areas of environmental areas or woodland or any other bits on the farm like that. And what this information is doing is this is then populating your carbon footprint. When we get to the stage of the carbon footprint, this will break down into your carbon footprint per hectare. So this information is being totaled up and used for that per hectare amount. This next bit in terms of annual sales, this allows you to have your carbon footprint per tonne of produce, because as I said at the beginning, we're not just producing these emissions for the sake of them, we're producing them because we're producing food. So this allows you to then have your carbon footprint per tonne of product. This last bit down here is about where you're drawing the boundary around what's included in the footprint and what's not. So for the vast majority of users, we would select farm here. If you are direct selling to your consumers, or you are in control of your distribution network and you want to include those, you can also tick these boxes and you can include those as well. But for the vast majority of people, we're just looking at farm. And then you come down here and you save it. And that's that first page done, which hopefully hasn't been too painful. And then we're into the bit where we put the information in. You can see that those categories that I showed you on the spreadsheet are also replicated down here on the left-hand side. So we're already in our fuel section, where we're going to enter information about our electricity usage, any renewable energy we either use or produce on the farm, our diesel usage, and all those other bits and pieces that are within that fuel category. And any new entry that you need to put in, you just click the Add New button, and it will then give you a list of drop downs that will show you sort of categories that are relevant to this topic. So you can see here that we've got liquid fuels, which is our diesel or petrol or anything else we're using on the farm, and we just put it in and we put the litres in, and then we hit save. And you'll see now that we start to get a build up here of the results from our fuel section. So that donut in the middle there is showing you the breakdown of our fuel emissions by the different entries, and you'll see that now over on this right hand side we've got this starting to be populated over here as well. So that's our diesel usage. In terms of diesel usage, if you're using it yourself on the farm, then obviously you have to you know, read your invoices and that sort of stuff. If you're using contractors on the farm to do various operations, then you can see that we've got a contractors tab down here. You can put in your contractors information either by the amount of fuel they use, if you know that, or you can do it on an operational basis. So you can see here there's a range of different things that your contractors might be doing for you on the farm. So for example, if we put in, I don't know, baling, for example, we would put in the number of hectares that they're baling for you. And that's the way, and you just add these all up. So they all go in terms of the different things that are going on. And you can see now that we're starting to get a breakdown here in terms of our diesel usage, in terms of whether that's coming from contracted work or whether that's coming from our usage there. So we can just add these all in. So that's how we put in our diesel usage. Electricity goes in under electricity, unsurprisingly. And again, here you can specify whether you're using an average tariff, whether you're using a specific renewable tariff. So if you've got a tariff selection which allows you to have a renewable energy tariff, but you're using the energy on the farm, that would go in under that renewable tariff, and it gives you a lower emissions factor associated with it. If you are producing renewable energy on the farm and you're exporting it back to the grid, then you can add information in that electricity tab here. in terms of electricity exported to the grid. So if you had a load of solar panels or a wind turbine and you were sending energy off the farm, then you will see that down here now, that's now got a minus number next to it, because that's providing a benefit back to you in terms of that electricity that's leaving the farm. And you'll see it's now down here in an offset. Anything else in terms of fuels? So fuels is mainly diesel, electricity. If anybody's got biomass boilers or any of that sort of stuff on the farm, that information all goes in under solid fuels. I wouldn't worry too much about cars, public transport or accommodation unless you're doing a lot of that. It tends to be stuff that's related to the business, but from the bigger picture stuff, it's only very small. So unless you want to go super detailed on it, I would ignore those ones and just concentrate on diesel and electricity, or gas if you're using gas for grain drying and stuff like that. So if you are grain drying, that information is all in there in terms of the different ways. Also, if you have an AD system on the farm, all that information is down here too. But you can put that all in. Fuels tends to be quite an easy one. It's just a case of finding the invoices and making sure that if you have 1 meter that does the farmyard and the farmhouse, you just make a bit of an assumption for what's being used within the house and take it off. Materials is anything that you are using on the farm within that 12-month period that you're footprinting for. So this might be if you're doing some fencing, if you're doing a little bit of maintenance work in terms of any building materials. Water usage also sits within the materials tab. If you need a new tyre for the tractor, any of those sort of things. And there's a huge range here in terms of the drop-down list here, in terms of a range of different things that you might be including. So if you were doing a little bit of concreting, for example, you can put that information in here in terms of the different ways it's being brought in. If you wanted a new tractor tyre, that information again would go into tyres. The one that's quite often hard to find here is things like if you're making silage or haylage, in terms of the bale wrap and all that sort of stuff that you use goes under consumables. So if you click on consumables and then agricultural consumables, there's a range of different silage sheet and bale wrap and all that sort of stuff down there, and you can specify which one's yours and how much of it you've used. That information can all go in there, and you can save that. Materials tends to be quite a small percentage of your footprint. So again, if you're looking for those big ticket items that you want to do first, I would ignore materials and go for fuels, crops, inputs, livestock. Okay, so again, it's a nice to do rather than a need to do materials. Okay, but again, all of the different things you might use are in there, and the other interest, as I say, the other thing that's in there that you need is water. So water goes within this water and sewage thing here, and again, if you're mains water or if you're on a borehole, you've got those different options there in terms of putting them in. And you can see now that we've started to build up the information in the two different categories. They're now coming over here on the other side as well, so we can start to understand what's going on. Inventory is our capital cost of all of our items on the farm that are under 10 years old. So that's and it takes account of the embodied energy within our buildings, our tractors, our machinery, all those sort of things. What we can do is that we only have to put this information in once, and then when we come to do our report again the next year, it pulls that information in automatically. So any of our tractors, the way that we add those in is they are evaluated on their horsepower. So that would go in under our farm machinery, and then we would just click tractors, or you can also, combines, forage harvesters, loaders, all that sort of thing come under this tab here. You just name it in terms of the, whatever you want to call it. Horsepower, so the engine size, year that you brought it onto the farm. So if you have second-hand equipment, but it's still under 10 years old, you would still take account of it here. So again, if you bought something that was 3 years old or 4 years old or something, and you were sort of footprinting in year 8, you'd still take account of it. So it's worth putting in the year that it came onto the farm, and then you save it. And then those information, once those items have got past that year where they're counted, they then drop off and they go into the inventory archive at the bottom. So you'll see then that they're not being accounted for. So that's how we do tractors and machinery. You can do implements in terms of drills, plows, all those sort of things. You can either do them by trailers, You can either do them by weight, if you know their plated weight, or you can do them by width, whichever is easier for you to collect that information. And again, it's exactly the same as we did them in terms of the machinery. You just put the name in of what you're doing, put the tons of metal in that's in there, and again, the year that it came onto the farm, and then you just save it. And that information is in there too. Now, buildings, if you've put up any new buildings, or done that sort of thing, then that information also goes in here. And there's two different ways that you can put buildings in. So you can either use the sort of proxy information that we've got here, which sits under the agricultural buildings tab, which you would just click custom build there, and you just put the name of the building that you put in, and then you just put the floor area in it. And we've built the calculator so that it will take account of the building materials on a per meter squared basis. So this is using sort of standard agricultural construction, so using, you know, concrete floors, panels, boarding, all the rest of it. If you've put up a building which has bespoke, you know, bespoke materials that you've used, and you need to take account of those separately, then you can also customize your build, but you need to know the amount and volume of materials that you've used, and you just enter into those materials in separately, and that information goes in here, and you would just click in custom, enter your own materials, and we're going to put new sheds, and then we would save it, and then we would just go to that project down here, new shed, add materials, and then we just add in the amount of concrete, the amount of wood, all those other sort of things that had gone into that building. So that's how we do buildings. Again, inventory is something that you probably only have to do once, and then it's quite easy to sort of just update every now and again. So crops take account of the emissions associated with our annual crops. So one of the questions that I quite often get at this point is, why isn't grass on the list of crops? And grass is on the list, but only if it's being grown as an annual crop. And obviously for, you know, 99.9% of us, we're not growing it just for 1 year, we're growing it over a longer time period. Because how the emissions are being calculated within this cropping section is that it's taking account of how the residues are dealt with. So when that crop is harvested, what's happened to the bit of it that's left behind in terms of when that straw from a cereal or those other bits and pieces are incorporated back into the soil, there's a source of nitrogen there which produces a nitrous oxide emission. So that's how these emissions are calculated. And there's a range of different categories here in terms of our crops. And the information that we need to put in is we need to select the crop that we're growing, and then the harvestable ton. So how much we harvested off that field, or the number of fields that are growing that crop. You'll also might see here that we don't differentiate between winter and spring varieties. So again, it's just total yield. So if you're growing some winter wheat and some spring wheat, for example, you just total up the harvested yield from the winter and the spring and add them together. Because in terms of the emission, it doesn't differ just from the crop itself. It doesn't differ whether it's a winter or a spring one. So we would just put in here our total harvested tonnage of that crop. That would start to go in there, and you just add that up for all of your different crops, and you just enter them here within these. If you're growing maize, obviously maize can go in there. If you're growing stubble turnips or any of those other sort of things, or kale or any of those for a fodder crop, all of those bits can go in there. So yeah, you just add all these up in terms of the amount of what's going on, and all that information goes in. The other things that go in the cropping section here are if you're applying any lime. So if you're doing any pH correction, that all goes within the lime and mineral fertilizers tab there. And if you're bringing any sources of organic material onto the farm that you're not generating yourself. So if you're importing any muck, digestate, sludge, biosolids, any of those sort of things, all that information goes in here. So you can see that organic fertility sources, we've got compost, digestate, or manure. So if you're bringing in any sources of those, you can put that in there as well. And that will calculate the emissions associated with that stuff that was produced off the farm, but you're bringing onto the farm. If you're using your own materials in terms of what your livestock are producing, we'll take account of those within the livestock tab. But this is just stuff that you might be bringing onto the farm from offsite. So that's our cropping tab. Inputs is everything to do with our fertilizers and our ag chem. And there's a list here of a range of different fertilizers that you might be applying. So all you need to do is put that, you know, select your fertilizer type and put the tonnage that you're using. If you're using a fertilizer that isn't on the list, then we also have a custom tab. So you can see if you select fertilizer here and you go down to a custom blend, you have to select the amount that you're putting on, and then the breakdown in terms of the percentage of NPK that's within that product. So if we were, you just put the breakdown like that and then save it, and it will calculate the emission associated with it for you. So you can see there that that's now being represented here. The other thing that goes within this tab is the Ag Chem, and currently the Ag Chem is a bit of a pain in the backside to put in, because what you need to do is you need to be able to understand the kilograms of active ingredients in the 4 different main types of Ag Chem. So that's fungicide, herbicide, insecticide, and growth regulator. But the update that's coming in January, you'll just be able to select the different products, and the calculator will calculate what that's providing in terms of an active ingredient. The carbon footprint associated with Ag Chem is so much smaller than the fertilizer that there hasn't been as much research focus in terms of understanding all of that information. So all they've done is they've just got those broad categories in terms of active ingredient for those different breakdowns. So it's something that there will be more work into as we go forward from the research community in terms of making that more nuanced. But at the moment they're just classified according to whether it's a fungicide, a herbicide, insecticide, or a growth regulator. And that information then goes in under that sprays category, where you can select that, and then you can just put in your kilograms of active ingredient. If you're running a Gatekeeper or one of those other sort of farm management software systems, they will be able to calculate your active ingredients for you. But as I say, come January, you'll be able to do it within the calculator. Livestock, for you livestock farmers, is where we add in all of the emissions associated with the animals themselves, how their manure is dealt with, and then any feed that's coming onto the farm to feed them. So you'll see a range of different categories here within the drop down. So you've got a range of different class of animal. And how this works is that behind the scenes, the emissions factor is calculated based on 3 main things. So for a dairy cow, it's based on the milk yield, and it works on an average of an 8,500 litre cow. So that's why if you're entering in dairy information, it'll ask you for your milk yield, because it just needs to know whether it needs to adjust based on your system. If it's a beef system or non-dairy cattle system, it's based on a weight. So again, a lot of the default emissions factors are based on a 600 kilo cow, for example. So again, if yours are lighter or heavier than that, it will make an adjustment. And then it's also based on what happens to the manure, because we've got 2 main sources of emissions coming from our animals. We've got the methane from our ruminant animals as part of that enteric fermentation and that breakdown of our forage, but we've also got methane and nitrous oxide in what happens with the manure. So we need to understand where those manures are being produced and what we're doing with them in terms of our handling. So if, for example, we looked at beef cows here, for example, we would have put in the number of cows that we have currently this year within the herd. It's also asking you for a number of livestock last year, and I'll explain why in a minute. So we will put in the number of cattle that we had last year. We then need to decide how our manure is being handled, so whether it's being produced and stored as slurry, whether it's being produced and stored as a solid material in terms of FYM, or whether it's being deposited in the field by the animals while they're grazing, which is this in-field manure. This bottom one, in terms of daily spread, nobody really tends to fill that in unless you're they're in and you're spreading it daily. So it's you know, fresh manure, and you're putting it out on the field, in which case you could put some into that category there. But it tends to break down in terms of if they're in half the year and out half the year, then it would just look like that. And the average weight of your animal, you would just put in your kilos there. And you would add that in for all the different classes of animals that you have on the farm. The other thing you can put in here is if you'll see that we've got 3 different feed categories down here. So if you're an organic system, you can differentiate in terms of organic feed components that are coming onto the farm. And these are for your straights. So if you're buying in straights to feed, you can see here that you've got a range of different things that you might be feeding as a straight. There's a slightly smaller list on the organic than the non-organic. Again, as the information is being produced by the sort of formatting research, we can get better results for those. All of the different things that you might be feeding. So again, silage here is only if you're bringing silage onto the farm to supplement what you're producing on the farm. If you're producing it on the farm, don't add it here, because you'd be double counting it. So for example, we can put in that we're bringing something in, and we would just put it in there, and it would save it. If you're feeding a blend, you can also put it in terms of blend. So there's a range of different categories down here under the blends tab, where you can look at what the breakdown is of that material. It's fairly swayed towards dairy at the moment. It's a bit of work that I'm currently looking at in terms of making that list much more, much wider. The problem is that getting the recipe formulations out of the feed companies can be slightly tricky. I almost have to sign the Official Secrets Act, so it has taken a little while to get some of the recipe formulations out. But you can put that information in there in terms of the quantities that you're using, and that information goes in there. And you'll see that as we're starting to do this, this is all sort of, you know, building up on this side here. So waste, again, what you do with your rubbish on the farm. So if you are recycling it, then that provides you with a carbon offset. So there's a range of different categories here, you know, and you just put in how much is going to landfill or how much you might be recycling. If you're recycling it, then you can start to see that you're getting a benefit here, which again starts to populate down here in your offset. If you don't need one of these categories, so if, for example, you weren't looking at distribution, then you can just turn it off. So it won't ask you to put in for any information in. Again, with processing, just turn it off. It's from some work that we do with the Sustainable Wines GB, where they look at wineries as well. So just turn that one off. And then sequestration. So this is where we enter the positive stuff that's going on the farm. And there's two different ways that we do this. For most of the categories within sequestration, it's on an area base. So we put in the area of the different things. The only one which is a measurement based is soils, which I'll come on to in a minute. So you'll see here, add new, the same as we do all the others. And you'll see a range of different categories down here. So woodland, for example, you can either enter in as broad categories, or if you've got loads of information in terms of dominant tree species, in terms of age of woodland and all those things, you can put it in as a detailed category. So if you want to just put it in as the broad categories, you just define it as mixed, broadleaf or coniferous, and you just put in the area that you've got there. If you, as I say, if you wanted to put in that more in-depth information, the reason that you might do that is because depending on the age of the tree or the age of the forest, it will have a different sequestration value attached to it. So if you've got a lot of teenage woodland, so woodland that's between sort of 17 and 40 years old, then it will be having a much higher level of sequestration than if you use the broad category. And so one example of that is that we do have a farm that we've done some work with, actually went from being a net emitter to a net sequesterer just by logging each individual portion of woodland, because they had a lot of young woodland. So if you've got a lot of young woodland, it is worth putting it in under those detailed categories. And all you do there is you just select woodland and you select detailed category there, and then it just gives you another drop down, which is giving you your main species that's within that woodland, for example, and then the hectares of it, and then the age, and it gives you a range of different age categories that you can put in there, and you can save that. So we'll probably see there that you can see that by putting in just that 5 hectares of oak, because it's at that higher rate of sequestration, it's half of what, you know, it's half of what that 20 hectares is, because again, it's taking a more conservative estimate on those broad categories. Hedgerows again are measured on an area basis, and then you can differentiate between whether you are cutting them annually or letting them grow longer. And it's one of the things that we can all do on farm that has minimal impact on day to day, and actually has a really good impact in terms of on our carbon footprint. So we just put them in terms of meters, and then how wide they are. So again, if we put them in there in terms of the fact that we're cutting them every year, we can see there that that's having a sequestration benefit of just sort of just under 4.5 tons. If we change that and we cut them, we let them grow longer and bushier, we can then see that the impact of that on our carbon footprint is meaning that it's almost doubled just by letting them grow longer. So it is something that we can do that makes a difference. If you have areas of stewardship on the farm, at the moment, we've got a category here which is sort of called uncultivated field margins, and it's a bit of a sort of catch-all category for buffers, for any of those other bits and pieces that you might have, which you've got your environmental stewardship on, which have a sequestration value. Again, it's something that we're looking to improve in terms of being able to put a value, put a value on some of those, pollen and nectar strips, or other bits and pieces that you might have on the farm. But you can put them in here. in terms of at least making sure that they are included within your calculator. Other things that you might want to put in here, if you've got any areas of perennial crops, so if you've got any orchards, other bits and pieces, miscanthus, willow, you're growing any of those sort of things. If you've got any, what else would you put in that category? Yeah, vines, any of those sort of things, they all go in under perennial crops. If you've got any ponds or areas of wetland, you can put those in under permanent wetland. And then we have soils. And soils currently are done by a measurement-based approach. And you have to have 2 time periods when you have a measurement. One of the things that we're working on at the moment is taking what we've learned through Soil Carbon Project, and obviously that will fit in to this quite soon. But at the moment, the way you do it is you have to have 2 years worth of measurements, and then it calculates the difference, what that's meaning in terms of an annual difference, and then it will give you a sequestration. So field reference in terms of, you can do this across areas of the farm, or you can do this on a field by field basis. So the area of the farm, if we said that our grassland, which I think we put in as 100 hectares, you need to put in your bulk density. And again, if you don't know what your bulk density is, the reference values are on the website so that you can say, well, I'm this soil type, this is about what my bulk density is. You can put in your measurements. So again, what depth you're measuring at. So are you measuring to 30 centimeters or to 50 centimeters? If you're separating out those 2 measurements, you can also then stack. So you can say, this is what the value was at 30 centimeters, and this is what the value was, say, 30 to 50 centimeters. So you can put in your depth. So that's saying we're testing to 30 centimeters. And say, for example, that we tested in 2014, and then we tested this year again, and our soil organic matter had gone from, I don't know, 5.5 back in 2014 and is now 5.75. That will calculate what that means in terms of an annual increase. So then if we hit save there, we'll see that we're now got that sequestration is now being taken account of within our calculation here, and is providing 292 tonnes of sequestration. So that's been a bit quick canter through how we do the data collection and the data results. You now, if you click the view results, view reports, it will now show you what that looks like in terms of your results. And this is the bit, as I say, that data collection bit. Is the sort of just bit that you have to get through to get to your results here. And we can see here, we've got our carbon balance, which is our emissions, take away our sequestration, which gives our carbon balance. And carbon footprinting and the reports work a little bit like an onion in terms of they've got layers, and the more you delve into them, the more you understand what's going on. So this is great. It tells you that's your carbon balance. It tells you that this farm is emitting 1,200 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that carbon dioxide equivalent doesn't mean that it's all being emitted from carbon dioxide. It means that's the sort of common reporting language that we use to take the emissions that are coming from carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane and put them all together. So that's great. That tells us something, and we can see here what that means. It doesn't tell us anything in terms of what we might do differently. So we can start to work down and get into a bit more detail. So we can see here that we then have breakdown of emissions and sequestration. So we can see that we've got a lot of our emissions are coming from livestock and fertilizer and fuel. And on the sequestration side, you can see that we've got some coming from woodland and from soil organic matter. If we go down a bit further here, we can understand what our carbon balance across the farm is, our carbon balance per hectare, and our carbon balance per tonne of product. We then start to get these tables which show the percentage of emissions that are coming from each of those different categories. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple more things while we're here, and then I'm happy to open up for questions. You'll see that you've got these 3 tabs along the top here, which allow you to delve into a bit more detail. The summary, the bit I've just shown you, is that headline stuff. If you go into the detailed summary here, you will get those sort of high-level categories in terms of the tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent and the percentage of your total emissions that come in from each of those categories. If you go into the full results, everything that we've put in is there in terms of its percentage. What the other thing that's on this page is that you'll see here there is a link. And that link button takes you to the relevant page on the toolkit to allow you to understand, so what might I do to reduce this? So I don't know whether this will work, I'll try. But that will then take you to the page on energy efficiency and energy consumption, so that you can start to understand what might be some of the things that you might be able to do to reduce that. It's not working for some reason. Anyway. You'll also see this confidence button here, and that tells you, that's a sort of understanding of how robust and reliable the science is behind it. So for example, on this fuel information, the science is really good because there aren't many variables. the emissions associated with a kilowatt hour of electricity doesn't change much depending on the weather or those sort of things. Whereas when we get into some of the more biological emissions, there's a lot less confidence in those because it's a more complicated thing to look at. The only other thing I was going to show you on here is if we look within this livestock tab. I don't know how many of you guys have heard about some of the work going on with GWP star and the alternative way of measuring methane. And that's a sort of link to when we had to put in the number of animals we've got this year and the number of animals we've got last year, because the metric can be applied when we look at the sort of size of your herd and whether it's staying the same, growing or decreasing. And you can see that we've put the information about the impact of that new metric here within the full results. So this is the way that we would calculate it using the traditional way of measuring for it. And then we can adjust that here. So we can see that actually the emissions associated with our cattle, with our 250 cattle, doing the traditional way of measuring it is 600 tonnes. But actually, if we apply this new metric, this GWP star metric, it actually takes 507 tonnes off that 600. So we're left with about 93 tonnes, which is the emission associated with our animals. You'll see that we can't apply that metric to our feed. So we still have to deal with the emissions associated with feed, but the emissions coming from the animals themselves, this new metric can be applied. So the last thing I'm going to show you is the fact that once we put that information in, once we then go back to my reports, that this report that we've just done is then here. There are 3 things that you can do with this. You can then, when you come to do it next year, you can just copy the report that you've already done. So the actual process of putting the data in is only hideous once, because next year you can copy last year's and then just update the bits that have changed. So that's a useful function to know. The only other thing I'm going to show you is that once you're in your report, you have various different options of what you might want to do with it. You can download it as a PDF and you can save it. You can put it on the wall. You can frame it. You can do whatever you like with it. You can share it. So that gives you a URL that you can send to anyone you might like to. The other thing you can do is you can compare it. So once you've built up a couple of examples, if you if you copied it and said, and this can be really useful for scenario planning. So if you want to say, well, what would be the impact of me managing to, improve my nutrient use efficiency? So say on this example here that we've got, if we analysed our manure and realised that it was quite high in, high in P and K, so actually we could change our fertiliser that we were applying because we were taking more account of what's in our manures. We would go into our, sorry, we'll just go back a second. We could copy that report. So if we go back to our reports, and if we copied it, sorry, the zoomy bit's in the way. If we copied it, and it would then appear here. If we then go to view report, and we edit the details so that we can call it something different so that we don't get confused, with fertilizer reduction, for example, and we just save it. And then if we went to our fertilizer tab here, and we were to change our fertilizer from that blended fertilizer that we put on there. So if we went down here and we edited that and we got rid of that, so we had 80 tons of product, for example. Let me just write that down. So if we got rid of that one, because we weren't going to apply it as a blend because we realized that our manure had all of our P and K that we wanted in it. So we get rid of that. And we thought, well, actually, we're just going to replace it with some straight ammonium nitrate because we don't need the blend. How many tons of that did we have? It was 80 tons. So we can put that in there. We can then go back to our reports. So view our report. And we can compare that to our other one. And we can see here the impact, the difference between those 2 things is actually a reduction of 17 tons. So it's a really quick way to say, well, what would the impact of doing those things be? And we can see that it's gone from, hang on a minute. That's it with the fertilizer reduction. I thought that was the wrong way around there for a minute. So yeah, we've managed to go from our carbon balance has gone from 12.7 to 12.5. And we'll see that if we then go down here in terms of that's where the emission change has happened. We haven't changed anything else. And you can start to model all those different things and look at the impact of doing things. So hopefully, if I just stop that a minute, and then as I say, I'm happy to take questions, but just to finish this bit off, there we go. Just to finish, so use none of the, hopefully that's given you a bit of an understanding of how to do the data entry. Carbon calculators are a really useful tool to help plan what you might want to do in the future, and baseline where you are now. It gives you that line in the sand of just being able to say, this is where we are, and these are some of the things that we might want to look at. It's really important to have an understanding of the background and the sort of how it works of the one you're using, you know, because then actually you can have confidence in the results that you get out. Find one that works for you. Okay, so if you want to look in detail in terms of the impact of your management, then you could use ours. If you want just to, you know, look at marketing your carbon credentials, then potentially you could use a different one. None of them are perfect. One of the sort of the results of everybody focusing on this area and actually carbon calculations and footprints and all that being much more commonly talked about is that one of the good things about that is that it's hopefully stimulating more research, and we're getting a better understanding and a more nuanced approach. None of them are perfect yet, but just because none of them are perfect, it doesn't mean we can just kick it down the road and not start. We've got to start understanding where we are now, and actually just accepting the fact that they're not at the end point in terms of a done finished product. They will get better, but as I say, we've got to start somewhere. And I think that's it. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody's got any, or any specific things about the calculator if you want me to go back on and look at a certain thing. Also, as I say, if any of you've got any specific things about your farm that you want to get in touch with me afterwards, there's my email address, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Becky. We've got one great question in the chat, which actually links to a question that I had as well, which says that are wetlands, reed beds and ponds listed in the habitat categories, because some of them outstrip carbon storage of woodlands by quite a bit and are also becoming more commonplace on farms where natural flood management is happening or where they're used to filter farmyard runoff.
Yeah, so
a comment last week about like floodplain meadows, so species rich grassland.
Yeah, so certainly we've got that wetland category, which again you can include some of those in there. Certainly I think the whole area of the sequestration benefits of different environmental features is something that we need to get better information on. I mean, there was some great work that was done by CEH and others in terms of you know, that has those broad categories, and those broad categories are what feeds into the calculator. But actually understanding within that broad category of wetland, actually what's the difference between, as you say, a reed bed, a pond, you know, a peatland area, all those other sort of things, so that we can understand the value that they have, not just in terms of that habitat value, but also the potential carbon value. Because as that person, as whoever commented, you know, rightly makes thing, tree is not always trees, and actually some of our other habitats, you know, are almost, you know, are much more valuable in terms of their carbon storage potential and their sequestration potential. And the other interesting thing, which is something that I'm quite keen on including, is also how those habitats are managed, because that will also have an impact on their carbon storage potential. At the moment, we've just got a value for a hectare of wetland or whatever, but actually if we can also start to condition score that in terms of what condition it's in, as to whether it's, you know, in peak condition, whether it's in, you know, improved, you know, semi-improved condition, or in not a great condition, then we can start to, you know, help really start to add those benefits when we're starting to you know, recommend some of these sort of environmental and habitat creation things. We can show the carbon benefits as well, because, you know, that's when we can really start to stack these things on top of each other. So yes, short answer, yes, you can put woodland in there, but we need to have better categories and make them more nuanced.
Another question that's just come in on the chat as well. Tom's saying, apologies, his internet dropped out for a minute, but does the calculator take into account different diets for livestock, or is methane emission and diet relationship covered in some other way? And I think you did run over that briefly, but I think
yeah. So the emissions associated with the animals themselves take into account, they have a sort of set value on them in terms of their methane emissions associated with a sort of average diet, as it were. I say the main constituent parts to make that methane equation is their either their weight or their stock class, their weight, and then if say their milk yield or whatever if they're a dairy cow, and then we're taking account of the emissions associated with the dietary components in terms of the carbon cost of getting those things to your farm. But you make a really good point, Tom, in terms of there is this relationship between feed constituents in terms of what we're feeding the animals and the impact of that feed on methane emissions. And that's something which we need to, isn't included in most of the calculators in terms of the impact of that. So we can take account of the carbon cost of those feeds, and we can take account of the methane and the nitrous oxide that's coming from the cattle or the sheep or whatever. But actually the impact of diet on methane production is something that we're getting a lot more results from now. I mean, I know Northwick has been really prominent in terms of doing the cattle and the sheep work on the beef side, and I know SIUC and Reading and others have done a really good job in terms of understanding the relationship between protein levels and different different constituent parts of the feed to be able to put that in. So yeah, in an ideal world, not this January, but next January when we update it again, we'll be able to put that information in terms of not just being able to select your animal or your stock class based on type, weight, and what's happening with manure, but also being able to put in a sort of average ration that you're feeding it and be able to show the difference there. Because again, it's a really important point in terms of some of the things that you can actually do on the farm in terms of reducing emissions and reducing methane intensity is look at feed and what you're feeding. So again, it'd be good to be able to reflect that in terms of being able to see the direct impact on the carbon calculator.
Okay, another quite technical question coming from Sue, which I think you might be addressing in your update, but let us know. It says, with soil analysis, how does it address peat soils? Because cultivation makes peat soils shrink, but they remain high in organic matter. So how is peat oxidation taken into account, i.e. loss of depth of peat?
So there is a section within the sequestration tab, which is looking at what's going on with cultivating peat soils. So if you are cultivating peat soils, and I'm just getting up so that I can just make sure that what I'm saying is accurate, which I think it is. So within the sequestration tab, there's a bit there in terms of cultivated peat soils. So that actually, if you, for that exact reason that you say, Sue, is the fact that if you've got your measurements in terms of what's happening, it's there. If you haven't, then it uses a different model based on the fact that our organic peat soils are slightly different beast to manage than our more mineral soils. So that's within there. If you've got measurements, you can put those in. If you haven't, then there's a different model that works behind that in terms of also looking at whether you're losing carbon from those soils through that act of cultivation.
Great. Oh, another one just come in. Are there any benchmarks for different types of farm? E.g., once we've calculated our carbon footprint, how good or bad compared with similar farm types are we? Which I think you said might be coming in next year as well, but can you adjust that according to national figures, regional figures?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Thanks, Sylvie. That's a great question.
I think it's something we get quite a lot, and as I said at the beginning, the best person to benchmark with is yourself. But again, when you do it the first time and you haven't got that option to look at, well, where are we going in the future, it's really useful to be able to understand where you are compared to others, and it's something that we now. The problem we've had before is that we've not had the sort of volume of users using the calculator to be able to sort of extrapolate that data and use it, on a small number of farms. Because, if I'm brutally honest, if you go back 2.5 years, then, we didn't really have very many people using the calculator at all. It was really, either people that personally had a real passion for it, or, people that were doing it for a certain reason. Whereas if you look at where we are now, if you go back to 2018, we would probably have maybe 20-25 new users a month, whereas since January, since the new version launched, we're up at almost 4,000 users. So we've now got that sort of that core amount of data that we can start to provide that benchmarking. So again, when you select at the beginning in terms of your enterprises that you've got on the farm, as long as we've got enough of a cohort of information to be able to provide that benchmark while still protecting people's data, we will be doing that from January. The issue that we have is obviously, it will be difficult to sort of pull information out in terms of, because there's so many differences in terms of production systems and all the rest of it, and you could be benchmarking everybody to say, well, actually that's not quite what I do, because I run a robotic milking parlour rather than you, which is a sort of grass-fed. There's all those differences that will still sit within dairy, but it will be a start, definitely. And I think the other thing we have, although they're slightly more tricky to extrapolate, is there are benchmarks out there in terms of the average carbon footprint per litre of milk or per kilo of beef, or those sort of things. So you can look at those, and see where you sit with those. So for example, average carbon footprint per litre of milk is between about 0.85 and 1.2. For beef, kilo of beef is about again about 0.6 usually, between 0.5 and 0.6. So again, those benchmarks are available and out there if you wanted to apply them in the meantime before January.
Okay. Next question from Jonathan: does the hedgerow section allow for different hedgerow management practices, i.e. age, height and width, etc., and can you apply something similar to orchards as well?
Yeah, so the hedgerow at the moment just has those two differentiations between whether it's flailed annually or whether it's left to grow longer. But we are doing a bit of work at the moment, looking to try and extend those categories depending on, because again, one of the things we quite often get, not so much down here in the southwest, but if you go elsewhere where you've got just a lot more trees in hedge lines rather than the sort of predominant hedge species. If we've got banked hedges in Cornwall, how do we take account of what's going on with that? So a hedge is not a hedge in carbon terms, and it's something that we need to look at some of the existing data that's out there, or if you've got any recommendations of good sources to look at, then please let me know, because we're always keen on making the sections better and more informed. But I say we are able to just differentiate at the moment between cut every year and left to grow long. But yeah, you're right, there are definitely more options to do.
Okay. And another one from Tom in Devon: how are you getting more farmers to make use of the calculator, and do you think these sorts of calculations could become integrated in regulation in future? I mean, I know sort of part of this in that calculations like this are being integrated more and more into, or are looking to be integrated into things like assurance schemes. So I know AHDB are also looking at being able to calculate and benchmark carbon.
Yeah.
But do you think legislation as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think there is certainly chatter about how it works in legislation. And you're right. If you're leaf mark, for example, then you have to do a carbon audit as part of that leaf mark accreditation. And there's other bits and pieces that way. I think we have to be careful in terms of that balance between making it a legislative requirement, in terms of making sure if we do that, it's a great way to get lots of people to use it. But does it then become a box ticking exercise rather than actually a genuinely useful thing to do? And I think there's a really fine line there. There is some work going on within different supermarket supply chains and other bits and pieces that are wanting that information. And I think what we also need to try and do as farmers is we need to not retain ownership, but we need to make sure that we have confidence and credibility in the things that we're using, and making sure that sits alongside the fact that we can use these tools to be able to document our compliance with regulation, or document our the good effort that's going on, but do it very much from a farm level. We're trying to get farmers to use it because, as I say, it's a great opportunity to understand, and farmers come at our calculator from different angles. So certainly if you go back pre-COVID, when everybody was focusing on the environmental impact of livestock production, there were a lot of farmers that were using it just to sort of try and understand, well, are my livestock as bad as everyone says they are, or actually, what's going on? So that was a lot of an impetus of farmers coming to it. I say we get people that are coming in through different supply chains, or just wanting to understand, well, what's my current position? Everybody's talking about net zero. What am I doing, and what are the benefits that I'm providing, and how am I able to account for that? So I think there is a place for regulation, there is a place for compliance, but I think we also need to be able to maintain the flexibility and the ability to use it as a decision-making tool and a management tool, rather than just a compliance. I mean, they're still trying to work out what they're going to do, and whether they're going to call them the imaginatively named FERPs, which is the Farm Emission Reduction Plan, which I hope they come up with a better name, if they're going to use that, and obviously footprinting will be a key part of those sort of things.
Great. And another question from Jonathan, which actually links to questions that I've had when I've sort of talked to farms that have gone through this process. So Jonathan says, surely the amount of people on farm, for example, wives, children, families, farm cottages, contribute to the overall carbon footprint, e.g. fuel used in cars, electricity and heating, etc. So I think some advice about where the farm enterprise begins and ends is always quite
I mean, we tend to say that we're just trying to account for the things that are within the farm business. So, for example, things like electricity use in the farmhouse, all those sort of things. Yes, they will have a difference, and so we try and adjust those figures to take those out of the equation when we're just looking at them. But it is something else to look at in terms of looking at where do you then account for those? So if they're not being taken account of within the farm footprint, do you then have to do a separate footprint for what's going on in the farmhouse? And obviously we want to try and make this simplistic, but we also don't want to have, especially if you're doing comparisons across different farms, if you've got one farm that has a big, maybe has 3 or 4 different dwellings with lots of people in them and all the rest of it, are gonna be very different compared to one that hasn't. What we have found is that there's some estates that we're doing some work with now that are wanting to try and understand the estate-wide carbon footprint, and part of that would be things like the sort of commercial lettings and the residential property. I've got one which has got a pub on its estate that I'm trying to work out how we carbon footprint the pub at the moment, and shoots and all those sort of things. But they're wanting to sort of represent the estate carbon footprint and look at that transition to how do they become net zero as an estate. On a farm, I would say, as far as possible, to keep it simple, I would keep the farmhouse stuff out of it. That's what I tend to try and get people to do, just because then we can look at what are the things that we can assume we can actually do things about on the farm, rather than looking at we can do in the farmhouse. The interesting bit sometimes comes when I'm doing some work with tenanted farms, where potentially actually some work in the farmhouse in terms of some repairs from some dilapidations and all the rest of it would make a huge difference to their carbon footprint, and that can be a different conversation where you actually can then provide them with the information that helps them persuade their landlord to invest in some upkeep.
Okay, and another really good one from Tatiana. Can you use this information to sell your carbon sequestration to carbon emitters?
You will be able to, yes, in the future. At the moment, what we're missing in this whole area in terms of offsetting, there are protocols out there which soil testing tends to is working on. And making sure that we've got that consistent level of testing, and that the system isn't double counting or allowing sort of stuff to be not done in a transparent way. But yes, it's a really good point in terms of when we are looking at offsetting and selling our carbon on the farm to to emitters that want to work, want to engage with farmers, at what point does the farm individual carbon footprint come into the equation? Because if you look at sort of some of the precedences that have been set for some of the nutrient trading agreements that are out there, if you're paid by a water company or something like that to plant cover crops to reduce your nitrate leaching or those sort of things, they don't tell you that you have to get rid of all of your own nitrates before they pay you anymore. And so there's some sort of schools of thought that actually the individual farm doesn't have to be at net zero before it can offset its carbon, because if it's doing some additional management practices or something that's sequestering more carbon, then it doesn't matter if they're not. So again, we need some clarity on at what point is a farm able to engage with these in terms of providing that additional sequestration. Does the farm itself have to be net zero before it is able to trade? Or is it that we take what's going now as business as usual, and then any benefit is seen as an offsettable commodity. So I think we need, much as I'm not usually one to advocate more regulation, we need some guidelines over this sort of stuff to mean that the opportunities that we have as farmers, we can take ownership of this space. We can get the benefits rather than brokers and other bits and pieces taking that benefit from us. But it has to be done in a credible way, which means that we're not double counting or missing bits and pieces. And I think it's that level, that bit of information that we need. We know how to test soils for carbon. We've done, so that's what we spent the last 3 years doing. So we know how to take the tests, and we know how to feed that information into the carbon calculator. We just need to make sure that everybody's operating using the same parameters, so that we can make sure it's credible.
I agree, and I think the last question, which is one from me, is that if you are a farm and you've listened to you and thinking, great, want to give it a go, have thought about it before, but now I've seen what happens, I reckon I can do it. The stumbling block that I've come across a couple of times is measurements of soil organic matter. And as we saw when you showed the results, soil organic matter can play quite a big part of the sequestration of the farm. So if you haven't yet done 1 or even 2 measurements of soil organic matter, how is it best to approach that when you're looking at the calculator?
So I think
for January.
No. I think there's a couple of things you can do. It's always worth, if you've not done any soil testing before, it's always worth getting those first tests done, so that you've got that baseline. But the other way to approach it is that you put in all the information that you do know. So you put in all the areas of emissions, you put in any sequestration that's happening in terms of woodland or stewardship areas or any of those sort of things. And then the other way of thinking about it is thinking about, well, how much sequestration do I need to be achieving in my soil to offset my emissions? So you can play around with putting different numbers in that sequestration. So say if I manage to achieve a 0.1% increase across my grassland and a 0.05% increase across my arable, what would that provide me? And then you look at what that does to your balance. And then you sort of say to yourself, well, is that achievable? Is that in my gut what I think I'm doing through the practices that I'm doing? And then you can start to sort of assess it from that side. So you might not have the numbers, but you can start to appreciate the size of your challenge in terms of what percentage increase might you need, and then you can start to sort of back that up with testing, or say actually I might do a couple of fields that I one before I start changing something, and then this one where I might change something, and you can start to look at what's happening. You don't have to go out and test every single field. You can test a representative sample, but if you haven't got a baseline, if you've never done any soil organic matter testing, it's really worth doing a couple of fields as a baseline, so you've got that sort of line in the sand as to where you are now. And as I say, we've got loads more information in terms of how to do that in a way which is robust and measurable and all that sort of thing, which I can share with you guys.
Okay, and then a final question, and I think we will make this one the last one because I'm conscious that I think it is 6 o'clock now, is that if everything on your farm is over 10 years old,
yes,
would you enter them into the toolkit, even if it's a second-hand machine that's just come onto the farm? So if you buy second-hand things that are over 10 years old, do you put those?
No, don't put those on. That's another category you don't need to enter anything in. That's great. So if you've got all old machinery, even if it's second-hand old machinery, if it's more than 10 years old, that gets you out of a tab that you have to put anything in.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks everyone that popped a question in there. A big thank you to Becky. That was brilliant, and I hope has inspired a few more of us to start completing that, getting an idea of where we stand on the farm carbon scale. It was great to see so many FWAG Southwest members, and we're really sorry that we haven't been able to get together more this year, but hopefully the odd online event and our newsletters has sort of kept everyone going, and next year we hope to be able to relaunch our county competitions and things and be able to do much more of the more sociable stuff. But in the meantime, let us know if you have any more questions about today. Let Becky know if you've got questions that you wanted to address to her as well. I think her email address was there, but I'll make sure to send it around tomorrow as well with the recording, which has happened this week. So we will send that round for anyone that wants to recap or to catch up. And I think that's everything. So thank you very much, Becky, and have a good
No,
evening.
thank you to everyone for listening. Have a nice evening.